The NBA offseason's well behind us now, which means everyone who needed to get paid got paid. But just like every season, players don't always get paid the right amount, because a lot of times they actually get paid way too much. And this leads to teams having a bad contract on their books for years and years to come. So we're looking at every NBA team's worst contract. And I'll give a quick shout out to the Bucks, Spurs, Mavs, Kings, and Nuggets, because they're the 5 teams that have done a great job and currently have no bad contracts on their payroll, at least for now. While a team like the Oklahoma City Thunder isn't so lucky, because they currently have Davis Bertans on their roster making $17 million per year, which makes him their second highest paid on the team, which is huge for a guy that will probably not get any playing time this year. Bertans had one good season for the Wizards back in 2020, so they signed him to a 5-year $80 million contract, and it's been downhill ever since. He started 8 games since then, was traded to the Mavericks as part of the Porzingis trade, then to the Thunder just so they could get rid of his contract. Of course, it's not OKC's fault that they have him right now. They brought in his bad deal on purpose, but it just so happens to place them here in this video. While the Utah Jazz have Colin Sexton as their worst contract, I thought about giving this spot to John Collins since he's Utah's highest paid player right now, even though he's fallen off in recent years, but they have a chance to reignite him like they did for Markkanen, so he won't get the spot yet. As for Sexton though, well, he was signed and traded from Cleveland to Utah as part of the Donovan Mitchell deal, and the only reason I could imagine why they would give him a 4-year $72 million contract would be just to match the salary so the trade could work. Collins is a decent player, but paid way too much, especially if he's going to be coming off the bench. The Miami Heat are overpaying their point guard by even more, and we'll get to that in a second. But first I want to thank today's sponsor, Morgan & Morgan, who just so happens to be America's largest injury law firm. If you're ever in an accident of any type, contacting an attorney could be a big advantage, because they can look over your case and see all the options you have based on your scenario. And I know what you're thinking, dealing with a law firm could be a tedious and long process, but they've actually solved that, because you can submit a claim and have a lawyer review it in just 8 clicks. I know, it's wild, but they've modernized the injury law process for your benefit, and the entire experience will cost you nothing unless you win, which in that scenario would be a win-win. You can submit case details, sign contracts, and upload documents all from your phone. And because they're America's largest injury law firm, they have all the resources they need to fight to get you the best results possible. And it's how they've managed to get their clients over $15 billion. So remember, if you're ever injured in an accident, you can submit a claim at www.forthepeople.com/AustinSweat or by dialing #529 on your phone. A big thank you to them again for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get back to it. And like I was saying, the Miami Heat's most overpaid player is easily Kyle Lowry. When the Heat brought him in on a sign and trade, he had just averaged 17, 7, and 5, so they didn't have a problem giving him a 3-year $85 million contract. Well, ever since arriving on the Heat, he's done anything but that and has continued to fall off a little bit more every season. He's been getting older, so it makes sense, but thankfully for them, this is his last year on that deal. That's not so much the case for the Houston Rockets though, who just gave out 2 extremely bad contracts to Dillon Brooks and Fred VanVleet. I mean, both are terrible, but giving VanVleet 3 years at $130 million is by far the worst one. I don't understand how one of the most inefficient point guards in the entire league landed a deal making $40 million a year. With the Portland Trailblazers, they have DeAndre Ayton making $32 million for the next 3 seasons, and Jeremy Grant making about $30 million for the next 5. Ayton's isn't great, but the fact that he's still young gives him a pass. And the fact that Jeremy's goes on until the year 2028 makes his deal by far the worst on the team. A lot of people say he was overpaid. I honestly didn't think it was that bad. It is just unfortunate for the Trailblazers though that they signed him to make Lillard happy, then he left anyways. The Orlando Magic, well, for the most part they've managed their contracts pretty nicely. They don't have anyone on their team making over $20 million a year, which is extremely rare. If I had to pick a worst though, it's probably a split between Jonathan Isaac and Markelle Fultz, just because both guys are making $17 million this season, have been full of injuries for years, and still aren't playing at the levels expected of them. The worst one currently on the Detroit Pistons has got to be Marvin Bagley. He signed a 3-year $37 million deal last season and has once again been full of injuries ever since. His game still isn't any better 5 years in, and yet they have him on the payroll for 2 more seasons. I wouldn't be surprised if he's out of the league after his current deal is up. The fact that Miles Bridges is currently an active member of the Charlotte Hornets roster easily makes his contract the worst by far, just given the situation and the fact that he was allowed back into the NBA. And the fact that it's so bad that he beats out Gordon Hayward for this spot really says something. The LA Lakers are another team that have managed all of their payroll pretty well. And even though D'Angelo Russell only got a 2-year $37 million deal, I was surprised that LA picked him back up at all. He was extremely disappointing in the postseason, and it looks like this year he's picked right back up where he left off. Maybe it's just me, because I'm not a fan of D'Lo, or maybe he did just sign for too much money. The worst contract for the Clippers right now is either going to end up being James Harden once we see how things fully turn out, and if not him, I'd give the spot to Norman Powell just because he's making $18 million a year for 3 more years. On the Golden State Warriors, well, I think that one's easy. It's a pretty close tie between Chris Paul and Draymond Green, but it's gotta go to Draymond. Sure, Chris is 38 years old and making $30 million the next 2 seasons, but he can run the offense and score when needed. Draymond can only run an offense and can't shoot the ball. Not even to mention he just signed a $100 million deal, so he'll be making $25 million until he's 37 years old. And the dude's already limited enough as it is, imagine him in 4 more years. The worst contract on the Minnesota Timberwolves is obviously Rudy Gobert, and it's not even close, because he has one of the worst contracts in the entire league. I mean, he'll be making $40 million for the next 3 seasons, and is currently the highest paid on his team ahead of Karl Anthony Towns and Anthony Edwards. And he'll be making more than Anthony Edwards next year too. Not only was he overpaid at the time because the Jazz felt like they had to, but he got moved to the Wolves and didn't end up working out, so it's now twice as bad if you're a Timberwolves fan. As for the Celtics, well, it's the one-handed Jaylen Brown, who Boston had no choice with. The dude is currently on the richest contract in NBA history at $304 million. He can only use one hand, and he's going to be making $65 million in 2029. The NBA's wild. Gobert got $200 million and doesn't have a single post move, and Jaylen got $300 and doesn't have a left hand. It's just going to be rough when he's Boston's highest paid player by far in the 24 and 25 season. I don't really mind any of the contracts on the Washington Wizards. I think they have everyone where they should be, but I think this is going to end up being Jordan Poole's spot. I feel like all the negative things we saw him do on the Warriors are going to be amplified 10 times this year, since he has no veterans telling him what not to do. Trae Young's another player who's turned out to be pretty inconsistent, and he was actually a frontrunner for me as the Atlanta Hawks' worst contract, but he at least lives up to his expectations more often than not, while a guy like DeAndre Hunter, not so much. The man was supposed to be their 3-and-D specialist, their go-to guy on the defensive end that also had high hopes on offense, but most times I just forget he's even on the court. And for a guy that just signed a new $100 million deal last year, that's gotta be pretty rough if you're a Hawks fan. But hey, at least he actually plays, because the Knicks' worst contract is so bad he doesn't even touch the floor in Evan Fournier. Evan was brought onto the team through a sign and trade where he got a 4-year $78 million deal. Well, last season he was in his 2nd year of that when he got benched for most of the season. And even though fully healthy, he only played 27 games. And things aren't looking any better this year. All he does is score, so it can definitely hurt the flow of a team when he's on the floor. And with them bringing in a guy like DiVincenzo to an already loaded backcourt, it doesn't look like Evan will be getting any more minutes this year. The only reason they've kept him around is to use as a trade asset if anything comes up. Now with the Pelicans, I have to give their spot to Zion just because they pretty much had to give him a max contract last year, even though he hadn't stayed healthy at all up until that point. He wasn't healthy last year, and who knows if he'll stay healthy this year. But given the situation, the Pelicans now have him making $40 million a year until 2028, having no idea if he's going to be an injury bust or not. Of course, for reasons that don't need to be explained, the Nets' worst contract is easily Ben Simmons. People are saying that this is also his redemption year, but it definitely won't be. And nothing he can do in one season is going to make it seem like he's worth paying $40 million to. For the Cavs, I think it's got to be Darius Garland. Besides him, they've managed the rest of their money pretty well, but Darius is just starting out on a $200 million contract, and I don't know that he's going to eventually live up to that value, but we'll see. While the Toronto Raptors have their 6th man on a pretty bad deal in Gary Trent Jr. He just signed for 3 years and $44 million a month ago, and honestly, it's not terrible. My problem with him is that he's just way too inconsistent, but I guess as a 24-year-old 6th man, inconsistency is expected at that position. Obviously, the Chicago Bulls spot goes to Lonzo Ball since he's played 35 games since signing for 4 years and $85 million with that team. Now, the Indiana Pacers have a nice little roster full of young players on great contracts, and the only reason I'd say Bruce Brown has the worst one right now is because this year he's the highest paid on the team until Halliburton's big deal kicks in next year. Some people hated Bruce getting $20 million a year, but I loved it. And again, I don't think it was bad. This just kind of looks bad on paper. While for the Memphis Grizzlies, they have Luke Kennard making $15 million a year just to be a 3-point specialist off the bench. I was surprised watching him sign a 4-year deal with the Clippers back in 2020 because he came off their bench for the entire time and has continued being a bench guy ever since. I get the bench thing, his game's pretty limited. The amount of money was just the thing that threw me off a little. For the Suns, their most overpaid and worst contract is easily Bradley Beal, who's on one of the worst in the league right now. He'll be making $50 million for the next 4 years. He's making more than Devin Booker for most of his contract, and he's making Kevin Durant type money, even though he's nowhere near as good as either of those guys. I like what the Suns have gone for with this big three, but no matter what team he's on, I think Beal's overpaid. As for the 76ers, as always, this one goes to the reigning champion of this spot 5 years running in Tobias Harris.